Hey everyone, and welcome to Composers Play, where myself and my guests will be playing through some classic video games and chatting about all things music and audio. So, before we get strafe on end, crouch-rolling Crusader, joining me on this Composers Play is none other than the original composer of Crusader, Andrew Sega. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on this.
Hey, great to be here, yeah.
So, before we get talking about Crusader, how did you end up doing music for these games?
Yeah, so it's sort of a strange story. So I guess I had really been into music since I was very young. My great grandfather had an organ in the house, and I would sort of annoy people enough by trying to play it that they eventually got me lessons.
Okay.
And strangely, I was actually a fill-in organist at a church for a while when I was like 10 years old. Now, me, of course,
Wow.
being a very non-religious person, I still could appreciate it for playing some real classic Baroque music. But
Right.
that then gravitated to getting into computers simultaneously, and I used to make little tunes on my Commodore 64.
Oh, wow,
But
cool.
it really all changed when I discovered the demo scene in the world of tracking, which was obviously right around the time that I got an internet connection. So,
Right.
I would, and I don't even honestly remember how it happened, but somehow I ended up on IRC. And since we had only one landline, I had to be on from 9 p.m. to 3 o'clock in the morning when I could use
Sure.
the phone line, and started meeting people on various channels. This
Right.
was all sort of an outgrowth to some extent of the Ware scene in the 90s that then spawned demo scene channels like Coders and then Pound Tracks, which I was there for the early days of, where the musicians would hang out.
Wow.
Anyways, so hanging out there, meeting a lot of other musicians, I started to make and release my own productions. Got a little bit of a name for myself, and what happened one day was I was talking to someone, and they were like, "Look, we are working on this game at Origins called Crusader. It's going to use mods, and we don't have anyone in house who can do this type of music. So we, are going to sort of go to the scene to see if we can find people that can, deliver a game soundtracks with audio." Now, me at the time being like, God, I was probably 19.
Yeah, wow,
I'm
you were
like,
young doing this stuff.
sure, we could do it. And I was there with Dan, aka Basshead, and Alex Brandon. I'm like, okay, help me out, because it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you do some tracks, I'll do some tracks. We'll get paid. It'll all be great.
Right.
And so I basically, at least no remorse. I sort of pooped the entire thing out during a summer. And it was just really being in the right place at the right time and having the skills necessary to deal with this very particular type of music engine that they were using, which for the time was pretty advanced.
So, like, what drew you towards mods and not doing the MIDI stuff?
It was more just the practical reality of I only had sort of one old Casio. I remember it was a Casio CT6000, and it only had rudimentary MIDI out. And at the time, for whatever reason, I just got more into trackers. It was a much more immediate programmery way to me of making music and it lent itself well to the sort of styles that I was interested to. So, even though I consider myself a pretty good keyboard player, all these songs were just literally typed in one note at a time. And that's just, I don't know. That combined with the scene, I didn't really start doing anything based in real MIDI until years and years and years later.
Sure.
And even to today, a lot of the music I do is still done, some of it in programs like Buzz, which are essentially trackers. Now I'm using $10,000 worth of VSTs, but the way you enter music into the system, right, is similar to what it was 20 years ago. Yeah. Tracking music was really one of the earliest forms, I think, of remixing culture. So everyone, back in the day, I didn't have really any money. I didn't have a lot of gear. So I would take, all the songs were essentially open source, and that you can go in, take all their sounds, save them out, use them in your own productions, right? So a lot of the sounds in my earlier tracks are just taken from other people's. I'll take like a bass sound from here. I'll take some other sound from this.
Right.
And, I basically amass in this huge library of samples, and then I would sort of choose from those based on the type of track I wanted to create. And only later I acquired, when I eventually got a Roland XB50, which is around the time, if I recall, and this was a long time ago, but I think it was more in the second Crusader game where that came into play. I was able to really record my own sample libraries.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But a lot of No Remorse, I mean, these are all sounds that were taken, many of them taken from other people's, bits and pieces from other people's songs, all sort of melded together. And I did do a little bit of audio sampling. I would sample off CDs as well. But that's how you typically got sound. And you de-res them to this sort of grungy, 8 or 12 kilohertz, 8-bit.
Yeah,
because the songs all had to be small. I think our limit was around 300K back then. So you couldn't really do certain things were difficult just because of space limitations. The one benefit though is because it's the samples that take the space, not really the pattern data. You can still make songs that are long, just as you can with general MIDI. It's just it's the sounds themselves which are the limitation space-wise. So if you choose your sounds well, God, look at this UI.
It's great, isn't it?
So old school. My first job was working at Origin. I was only there about 6 months. I didn't really. This was after I contributed music to the soundtracks. And being inside the belly of the beast, though, I mean, it kind of ruins it a little bit for you. You see sort of how the sausage is made,
right?
And the magic is a little bit gone. That being said, I did, because of this, get to do a demo track version of Stones, and I got to play it for Richard Garriott with the idea that they're considering using a mod engine in Ultima 8, 9, one of those.
Oh yeah.
And he loved it. I think they ended up not going in that direction for sound engine purchases. But I did get to sit there, and he sat there in all black with this Ankh on, and listened very politely. And I thought I did a pretty good job. I have no idea if I still even have it somewhere. But
I listened to some of your own stuff, your produced stuff, and it's quite similar to this. I can hear all the kind of orbital and orb kind of influences, and
Orbital was an enormous influence. All that sort of first wave of IDM. Was hitting right around that, and that was definitely left a big impression on me.
Yeah. You can tell. I mean, it's great. Like, I think you did a remix of one of their tunes. Was it? I can't remember the name of some Orbital track.
It's probably Girl with the
Sunshine. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, it's awesome. And I found that I was like, that's who? Because it sounded familiar. I was like, and then I listened to the original, and I was like, oh man, I actually prefer your version, Well,
it was, it was more, almost like a cover, but it was more like just trying to see if I could recreate some of that stuff in, the limitations of a mod format, and
right,
you can get pretty close.
It worked, yeah. So, you were restricted to, was it 8 channels in mod? Right.
That's right. Well, the format isn't necessarily. So early mods in the Amiga days were 4-channel. The PC expanded. The PC sort of. It's just simply a matter of, on an Amiga there was hardware that could play the samples. On a PC, everything's software rendered, so there's no limit to the number of tracks. It's just basically how many can your CPU handle. For Crusader, they had their own. Jason Ely did a mod engine which could handle 8 channels. So that was basically the limitation that we would use. Now, that being said, one thing you can do is use chords and samples that are, my usual hackneyed trick was I would have, a pad sound, and I would have a major chord sample, a minor chord sample, like a sus2 sample, etc. Yeah. And you can use those to essentially make it seem like there are more voices than there are.
Yeah, in Phil you have this F sharp minor, and then layered on top of it you have an A sus4, and then
yes, and that was again, it was. I think it's a way to simultaneously do sort of cool sounding dense chords, but also it just simply is like that's a way to get 6 voices in 2 channels.
So what was your composition process when you were writing these tunes? Did you play them in with piano and then track them in, or how did you do it?
No, I mean D. Beyer. That's probably Dave Beyer, who was a designer back.
Oh, really?
At Origin. Yeah, that's funny. I didn't
Cool.
remember that. So yeah, I didn't really sit down much with the keyboard. For me, it was basically a combination of, I usually start with the beat. Like with this track, it was all about that drum loop. And once that was happening, I was like, okay, now let me grab some pads. And I was doing this sort of stuttery like pad thing, and then that basically you try some different chords over it, like, oh, this works, and then you build the rest of the song around that. It wasn't really, sitting down at the piano. I mean, I don't even know how you would play a song like this on a piano. I mean, it's more about grooves, really, and then you sort of, once the groove is there, you figure out what kind of a melody and what kind of sort of a chord structure you want to throw over it. Oh, I like this song. I forgot about this song.
Yeah, that's great.
God, I haven't heard some of this stuff in so long. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff from the really old time, anything that's sort of pre-2000, a lot of it has sadly been lost just, due to hard drive failures or due to just having things on some old machine that, I didn't continually back up every single file when moving from one computer to the next. And, the mists of time, sort of take this stuff.
This guitar is one sample, right? And you just, I don't know, you just make it sound so real with using all these cool effects like the portamento and stuff.
Oh, yeah. So you had the ability to do something. So one thing you could do, right, was portamento.
Right, yeah.
And in a track like this, also, you have a guitar sample which has sort of like a pluck, sort of like, the pick sound in the beginning of the sample, and then the end is bang. Right. So what you do is, when you want to do the accent notes, you play it from the beginning, but then for other notes, you sort of play it from a little bit in, so you sort of miss the pluck part of it, so it's a more of a smooth, like a fretting as opposed to like a real hard. So yeah, you could sort of manipulate these sounds to some extent, and yeah, it basically just one sample, and usually, you could go up, an octave or two before it really starts to go to shit. You also one of the most tedious things you had to do. So if you wanted like a looping guitar sound where the initial, it's one sample, but then you could set a start and an end loop point, so it'll just play infinitely if you sort of hold the note down. Now there was no editor to do this, so you basically had to sort of just manually keep slowly incrementing the values until you figured out a loop point that worked. You're essentially trying to find a zero crossing without being able to see the waveform.
Okay, so you don't get that.
It was very tedious, and it wasn't even always possible with certain samples, but usually you could make it work. So luckily, if you sort of shamelessly steal samples from other people, they may have already done the work for you of determining what good loop points are.
I do love the 3 songs in the bar. Just sit back and relax, and just
gotta have a nice drink at the Rebel Base, and you're
yeah.
Word has it all the survivors from this morning's raid are being held for interrogation.
This guy looks like he just woke up. He's like, oh god,
yeah. It's too early, man.
Fucking rebels! Oh my god.
The rest of the
smoking
job
a big
falls
stogie
to
as
you,
well.
Captain.
Jeez.
Once Andrews confirms your insertion coordinates, you are to locate and free the prisoners from H-37.
Oh,
After
so
you
terrible.
free the prisoners, Corporal Reeves will
He kind of reminds me of your man from Aliens.
Consult your data
right?
if you have any
Your
further
man,
questions during the mission. We're counting on you.
So do you have a favorite song from any of your music or from Crusader?
I still think out of all these, I think that sort of that first level track, Dimension 2012. I think that's probably my favorite. I mean, that really holds up well.
Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. Talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to to come in and talk to me. It's really cool.
No, of course, and and hey, thanks for sort of keeping some of these games alive. I mean, God, this is the most I've seen this game in probably 15 years. 15 years.
Oh right.
I mean,
it has to be done.
And it's I think it's in some sense it's important to understand sort of the history of video games and how these things
definitely
evolved over time, especially that games are now being regarded as sort of a real it's a real entertainment medium.
Right.
It's no longer sort of
Art.
this so and it has a history just like film has a history or music has a history,
Right.
and with the unique aspect that the limitations of computers sort of shaped both the PC scene and the console scene, and it's interesting to see how people sort of push the boundaries. And with Crusader, the first one of the first big games with mod soundtracks, an Unreal Tournament being another notable one, but
Right.
at the time this was like a revolution in game audio, and so it's important to sort of understand the historical context and and see how this was an important part of video game history.